Well, kids, you can be dismissed to children's church, apparently. Sometimes the worship and the sermon serendipitously line up, and that's wonderful. And in some cases, the bridge of the song is singing about tearing down walls, and we're going to talk about Nehemiah, who definitely built them. So I'm not going to take that as a sign that I somehow missed the mark this week. All right, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. In the month of Kislev, on the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. They said to me, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So in order to give you a proper backstory into the main character for today, who is Nehemiah, I would basically have to read and explain a greater part of the Old Testament. So for your homework, read the Old Testament. But the extremely shortened version goes something like this. In 597 BC, Babylon besieges Jerusalem, captures the city and its king Jehoiakim. As part of his conquest of the city, he loots the city and the temple and takes 17,000 officials, craftsmen, and soldiers back to Babylonia with him. He also appoints the king's uncle Zedekiah to be the king of the now conquered Judah. 10 years later, Zedekiah attempts to rebel against Babylonian rule by making an alliance with Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem once again, and this time burned down Solomon's temple, destroyed the walls of Jerusalem, and exiled the rest of the inhabitants to Babylonia. Fast forward 50 years. Many of the officials that were exiled from Jerusalem have been integrated into the bureaucracy of the kingdom of Babylon. In a strange turn of events, the whole Babylonian nation has now been conquered by the Persians. So there's a new king in Babylon, and he views these Jewish subjects somewhat differently than Nebuchadnezzar did. As we read above, Nehemiah was part of the ruling bureaucracy that was transferred from Babylon to Persian rule. Now, in order to understand Nehemiah's grief over the state of Jerusalem's walls, it's important to remember how politics worked in the ancient world. There was no threat of nuclear war, no modern militaries, no absurd UN or absurd theories about the world being a community of nations. Much of the known world was split into two distinct classifications. There were settlements or cities, and there was the wilderness that separated them. The larger the settlement, the larger the area of wilderness needed to sustain that settlement. I learned to think of these cities kind of like amoebas. The city is the nucleus, and the ill-defined body is the area of influence that the nucleus can control. If your neighboring amoeba gets too uppity, they will start taking resources that your nucleus needs to survive. So you raise an army, you raid the town, you crush the enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentations of their women. And as a result, you prevent your neighbor from growing stronger. This is just the way the world worked. You can call them city-states or tribes or pseudo-nations, doesn't matter. Politics were a struggle to maintain your influence in a very competitive world. If you felt threatened by your neighbors, you went over and smashed them in the face. It was barbaric. I very much prefer the constant soul-crushing, low-level anxiety of global thermonuclear war as a way to mediate geopolitical issues. We are much, much more civilized today. At any rate, the result of this state of affairs was that the size of your amoeba was dictated by your ability to defend your nucleus. And Jerusalem, a former regional powerhouse, had no wall. It meant they could not have a temple because people would raid it. It meant they could not set up a legitimate government because people would crush it. It meant that the commerce happening in Jerusalem did not happen in a busy and bustling market. It happened in secret and in squalor so as not to attract the notice of the neighbors. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1 through 5. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year, or Nisan, or Nisan. It's either Nisan or Nisan, depending on where you're from. In the 20th year of King Xerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "Well, what is it that you want?" Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so I can rebuild it." I really like the story of Nehemiah. It tracks with the way I try and exercise my faith. It tracks with my childhood. I grew up building walls with Legos in the house and dead sticks outside. Rebuilding a city's walls is just pillow forts for grown-up boys. Nehemiah hears about a very practical need for a wall. He puts in a request for a sabbatical, and he just goes and builds it. And the best part of the story is not the friends he made along the way. The best part of the story is the wall. Nehemiah is a guy who sees a need, and he just fills it. That's it. There are a couple of takeaways from this story, which I would like to highlight, so this feels more like a sermon and less about me being really excited about a wall. But first, to address the elephant in the room, yes, I'm sure it was a big, beautiful wall, and no, I don't think Mexico paid for it. First thing to admire about Nehemiah, he has the insight to identify a need and the courage in his convictions to pursue it. Most of us are not exiled government officials living far from our homeland. But all of us have an area in our lives that we can recognize as a wasteland. It might be a relationship with someone who is estranged. Maybe it's an addiction or a bad habit. Or maybe it's the whole dang thing. Sometimes our lives seem to feel like a dumpster fire rolling down a San Francisco hill. And I know I'm not the only one who has prayed to the God of heaven and said, "If your servant has found favor in his sight, help me rebuild this mess." So, case closed, right? So let it be written, so let it be done. Not so fast there, Mr. Name It and Claim It. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Remember those neighbors we were talking about? The ones that view the success of Jerusalem as a threat? Sanballat and Tobiah are certainly those neighbors. So Nehemiah leaves for Jerusalem. And after a couple days living in the city, getting settled, he takes a tour of the walls. Things are much worse than he had feared. In fact, there is evidence later in Nehemiah that no one was even living in the city, that even the houses had not been repaired, that everyone who had remained behind after the exile had been living in the wilderness or the surrounding towns. When his tour was complete, he comes back and says, "Hey guys, look where you're living. This place is a mess. You can't defend it. The walls are destroyed. The gates are burned down. Let's fix it." And the people replied, "Sure." So they did. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Gesem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. Now, I know you guys can relate to this because some of you have told me stories about your neighbors. But this isn't a shock. The first response we get when we try to clean up our lives is often ridicule. And to make matters worse, the Ammonites are the descendants of Abraham's nephew Lot. So in this case, they're technically family. Still, Nehemiah remains laser-focused on the goal, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now, the whole of chapter 3 lists the families of Jerusalem at that time and what section of the wall they were responsible for repairing. And keep in mind, these aren't just simple walls. They're about 8 feet thick, and 12 feet tall, and still in the burned-out heaps surrounding a burned-out city. It's a lot of stone to remove, repair, reshape, and rebuild. I'll spare you the butchering of a couple dozen Israelite names, but suffice it to say, everyone who was living in Jerusalem at that time must have been working on these gates. So this is the honeymoon period, right? This is the first 2 weeks of January when you are still sure you will exercise all year long this time and not just until Valentine's Day. Nehemiah has set a goal. He has inspired the people around him, and the work has begun. Chapter 4, verse 7 through 9. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, and the Arabs, and the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to the Jerusalem walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet the threat. This is where the analogy typically falls apart for me. I think that the enthusiasm will always be there. I hear the catchphrase like, it only takes 30 days to make a habit, and I assume that something similar to what happens to a crank start airplane will happen in my life. All I have to do is put in the right amount of effort for the right amount of time, and then my attitude will just suddenly fix itself automatically, and I'll fly off into the sunset. I assume that if I start right, at some point, the work I need to do in my life will take less effort. Not Nehemiah. He knows he's in this for the long haul, and he guards against the gathering trouble. Chapter 4, 13 through 18. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand, with a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore a sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. I don't know if it's prescriptive or not, but I did find it interesting that the first half of the building occurred with everyone's work focused directly on the building. But the second half was done with half the workforce of Jerusalem standing guard. So it would stand to reason that the second half of the work took twice as long as the first. None of us want to hear that. So you've prayed to God for strength. He's answered your prayer and given you resources to get started. You put in the work. You're motivated. You have enemies, but you know who they are, and you've been able to withstand their mockery. You can begin to see some progress, and all of a sudden, it stalls. How do you prevent the whole thing from collapsing? You guard the good work that you have started. You guard your renewed relationships jealously. You protect the accountability you've put together to combat your temptations and addictions. You prioritize your devotion routine. Whatever you are doing that has gotten you this far, you protect it. Paul tells Timothy, follow the pattern of the sound words you have heard from me in the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. By the Holy Spirit who dwells within us, guard the good deposit entrusted to you. And so Nehemiah changed his strategy. Now it wasn't just enough to enthusiastically hammer away and build. Now he had something valuable. Now he had something he needed to protect. Chapter 4, verse 21 through 23. So we labored at the work, and half of them held the spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. I said to the people at that time, let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, that they may be a guard for us by night and may labor by day. So neither I nor my brothers nor my servants nor the men of the guard who followed me, none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon at his right hand. I want to pause for a moment to consider what it was about this particular moment that made things dangerous for Nehemiah and the occupants of Jerusalem. Why was now the time that their neighbors start to pay particular attention? They didn't care about Jerusalem when Jerusalem wasn't a threat. But you and I know from our own experiences, when you are rebuilding your walls, when you are making improvements to yourself and to your life, when you are living up to the calling God has for you, when you are in danger of making a difference, that's when you become a target. One of the more difficult things for me to contend with as a Christian is the temptation to stay on the broad road, to stay lukewarm, to be committed to Christ, but not in a weird way. Part of why this can be so tempting is the knowledge that when we make a decision to deepen our relationship with God, when we stop straddling the line between what the world values and what God values, that is when the real fight starts. Chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. Now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, Come, let us meet together in Hekephram, which is a hard word to pronounce, in the plain of Ono. But they intended to do me harm, and I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work and cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave and come down to you? And they sent to me 4 times in this way, and I answered them in the same manner. I guess the theory here was if you can't beat them, join them. Has this ever happened to you? You're on a roll, doing good, making positive changes, and then someone invites you out. Nothing evil, nothing bad, just an invite to meet in the plain of a place named, ironically enough, Oh No. It's just an invitation to a peace summit. But Nehemiah refuses to go. That wouldn't fly in our world today, would it? These 4 little verses remind me of what Jesus said in Matthew 10:34. Do not suppose I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. At first glance, this doesn't track with any of Jesus' other teachings, where he advocates for peace and for kindness. He was heralded into the world as the Prince of Peace. He calls peacemakers blessed. But Jesus' message, in fact, one of the themes running through the entire Bible, is that good and evil exist as separate and distinct realities. Isaiah 5:20 says, Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. There is a temptation in the world today to even out the distinctions between what is good and what is evil. There is a theory that, from a certain point of view, with the right context, evil can be justified as a means to achieve the good. I don't believe this, and I don't think I can find any support for this in the Bible. I think we should strive for peace, but not at the expense of striving for good. Sometimes what is good will lead us to peace. But sometimes, in order to keep working towards what is good, we will be led into what? Conflict, violence, certainly discomfort. My ancestors, at least my Mennonite ones, not so much the West Virginia ones, knew that what is good sometimes stood on the other side of conflict. They chose to reject violence as a reaction to that conflict, Many of them were ridiculed, persecuted, lost their homes and all they had. Some of them even paid with their lives. Nehemiah built a wall and guarded it with armed men. And from the language in these verses, he was more than ready to defend this city with force if he had to. Don't know what the right way to handle conflict is. But what I do know is that Nehemiah didn't sacrifice what God had called good in favor of peace. I think this is a lesson the American church and us would do well to remember. Nehemiah chose what was good and risked conflict with those around him. In the following verses, there's a plot to discredit Nehemiah in the eyes of local officials in the hope that he will be deposed. In other verses, there are also rumors of an assassination attempt. But through it all, Nehemiah stays faithful to the task that God has called him to complete. Chapter 6, 15 through 19. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah's letters came to them. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ara, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, as his wife. Also they spoke of his good deeds in my presence and reported my words to him. Nehemiah finishes his project in 52 days. If we would start today, we'd be done by Christmas. And surprise, surprise, his enemies immediately turn into political negotiators. This is Tobiah the Ammonite, the same guy who was raising an army with the intention of destroying Nehemiah's wall project 3 chapters ago. And now here he is, hobnobbing with the nobles of Judah and asking them to put in a good word with this Nehemiah guy on his behalf. Just because the walls are finished, though, doesn't mean Nehemiah is done. Chapter 7, 1 through 3. Now when the wall had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hananiah and Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was a more faithful and God-fearing man than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. And while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own houses. Just because we know where the walls are doesn't mean they will do us any good if we aren't vigilant. Just like your own life, those city walls were made for a purpose, and the people of Jerusalem had a part to play in making sure that they were effective. In the same way, I believe God has made each of us for a purpose. Some of us think we know what that purpose looks like, and some of us may be entirely unsure how God plans on using us. One thing that we can all strive to be is an active and engaged participant in the plans that God has for our lives. When I was a kid, I built Nehemiah's wall out of Legos. And while I'm sure it looked nothing like the Jerusalem wall, I've always been inspired by the faithful man of God who saw a need, answered the call, and worked diligently to complete the good work God had entrusted to him. In our own lives, may we have the insight to see the need, the courage to pursue the goal, and the faithfulness to follow through, even if the journey takes us away from peace, but towards the goodness of God. Let's pray.